Okay, guys, so I am introducing you to Shakespeare the man. Because you can't study Shakespeare's works without studying the man behind them. He's one of the few authors in the world that you have to tie the text to the author. I had to do like a little mental true-false quiz just to see what you already knew and maybe what you didn't know. There's a lot that we don't know about Shakespeare. He was his life is not well documented. So what we know mainly from his works, church records, things like that. A few mentions from his contemporaries. So the first question I asked you was his full name, and we don't know his full name. It's just William Shakespeare. That's what's written in the church record. He was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564 on April 26th. He did grow up with 5 siblings, but he did not grow up poor. His father was a middle-class merchant. He grew up in a very good situation financially. He had a good education, not a great one, but he did have an education. And then I asked you how old he was when he got married. He was in fact 18, but his wife was 26. And then I asked you what her name was. Her name really was Anne Hathaway. And she was pregnant when they got married. So it's a little bit scandalous. They did have 3 children. One of them died. And he did live in London for most of his career, and his wife lived in Stratford. And the reason that's important is because a lot of scholars like to point to mentions of women and men in his sonnets, primarily a young man, and try and say that he had lovers outside of his wife. There's never been any proof of this, but it is something scholars really seem to like to harp on. There are 7 years where no records exist, so we have no idea what Shakespeare was doing, where he was, what he was writing. And they're called the lost years. I asked you whether he became very wealthy and famous in London. He did become very famous. He wasn't badly off, but he just wasn't super wealthy either. So he was sort of middle of the road. But he was very famous, and he was known to sort of be very proud of the fact that he was pretty famous. So he had a healthy ego, but the man could write, for sure. He did own part of an acting company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which became the King's Men. But he didn't lose a lot of money on it. He actually gained a lot of money from being part of this acting company. It was a very shrewd business move on his part. And he also had a stake in building the Globe. So if you've ever been to London, the Globe Theatre, big white theatre, very famous, is where the King's Men performed. And he actually owned part of it, which was a huge deal to be owning, real estate in London. Made you a lot of money. So he did have a son. His name was not Hamlet, it was Hamnet. And of course he did name Hamlet after his son. And he is the one that died. So he wrote under 2 different monarchs, meaning he wrote under Queen Elizabeth, and then when Queen Elizabeth died, he wrote under King James I. This is important because you have to contextualize a lot of his plays within who the monarch is. Playwrights were funded by, like most artists, were funded by patrons, and those patrons had loyalties to particular monarchs and kings and queens, and they were very high up. So you had to be very careful about what you said about who you said it. So if you're going to insult the elite upper class, you have to do it in a way that's very subtle, and that's what Shakespeare does in many of his plays. But he was well beloved by Queen Elizabeth, and if you know anything about Elizabeth, you know that she was called the Virgin Queen because she would not marry, because if she married, she would give up her throne to whoever the man was. She was a staunchly independent and fiercely powerful woman, and she genuinely loved Shakespeare's work. So when she was getting towards her 80s, she died in 1603. When she was getting towards her 80s, everyone started to get very nervous because she wouldn't name an heir, and there was a great deal of conflict over who would take over the throne, the Catholics or the Protestants. So the Catholics, the Protestants, it's too much to try and get into that, but basically suffice to say, 2 different groups trying to vie for the throne, Catholics, Protestants. In the end, the one that won out is King James. from Scotland, and his mother, Mary, was the one who was imprisoned and had her head cut off by Elizabeth. So you can imagine he wasn't, James was not loyal to his mother at all, but still, there's an animosity coming in, changing families basically on the throne. So Shakespeare was able to sort of navigate that very well, and you see that in his writing. He changes from Elizabethan writing. There's a certain style, tone, discussion of religious and politics within his writings during those periods. And then in the last 12 years of his life, you see a shift in his writing to his Jacobean plays, meaning his under King James. And in those plays, he has a different sort of tone and subject matter, and the way he talks about the monarchy and the elite and things like that. So it's really cool to kind of study the two of them and compare them side by side. So, but I'm getting off track. His contemporaries were Ben Jonson, his main rival. Christopher Marlowe was another one. They were professional rivals. They weren't personal rivals. And Ben Jonson actually has a very famous tribute to him after he died. He wrote a poem in his honor. It's a pretty famous poem. I asked whether Queen Elizabeth actually came to the Globe to see one of his plays. This is unfortunately false. So if you've seen Shakespeare in Love, you know that at the end of the movie she comes and she sits in the top of the Globe Theater in her box and watches the play, and it's supposed to be this wonderful honor. This was always a rumor that she showed up one day, but it never actually happened because in the Globe you have the poor people go in the front, that they stand the whole time. Those are the penny seats. Or it's not seats, penny standing. And then you have the middle class people on the first two levels, and then you have the upper level is for the rich people, and dead center is a box that is Queen Elizabeth's box. And it was always left open in case she decided to show up one day, which of course she never did because that's where the common people went. So there is also rumor that he didn't actually write his own plays. People think because he produced so many plays so quickly, and because they were so brilliant, and so every line is just packed with meaning or puns or something, that it had to have been written by multiple people. This is not true. We have so many accounts from his contemporaries about Shakespeare writing his plays, and people, just talking about how quickly they're selling out and all these things. So as much as people try to believe it, I don't think it's true. It's also amazing because there's a rumor that he helped write part of the King James Bible. So after James came onto the throne, he did commission the King James Bible version to be written by a number of writers in England. And I think Shakespeare might have been among them, because if you go to Psalm 46, at that time, it was 1610, he would have been 46 years old. And if you count down the number of words from the top, 46 words down and 46 words up from the bottom, the words are shake and spear. And people think that he might have had the guts to insert himself into the Bible. And I personally like to believe that is true, because I think his ego was a part of his sort of persona as a writer. He did die on April 23rd, 1616 in Stratford-upon-Avon. He's buried there. He didn't die there, but he was buried there. And in all, he wrote 37 plays and 154 sonnets that were published. There is a rumor that he wrote a lost play, which people think would be a sequel to Love, Labour's Lost, so it would be Love's Labour's 1. But this is unfortunately a rumor until the day that they find this play. It's going to continue to be just a myth. And he did write in 4 genres. So he wrote comedy, tragedies, histories. So Richard III, King Henry IV, any of these are history plays. And he wrote romances, but they're not romances in the sense of what you might think. Romance simply is a term that was attributed to a genre that he basically kind of came up with. Basically, they're also called tragic comedies. So The Winter's Tale is one of them. They have heavy tragic elements, but they end in a comedy. So they end in someone coming together in unity or in marriage. So that is a very brief introduction to Shakespeare. I hope you liked that little quiz. Hopefully you learned something. I want you to go ahead and now, you're going to do a little response about Shakespeare. And then you're going to start moving on to Act 1 of the play.